There is a particular kind of morning in the Blue Ridge Mountains when the light comes in at an angle so low and direct that it reads the land the way a hand reads a face in the dark by contour, by what rises and what falls, by the shape of things that have been standing long enough to become permanent features of the world rather than objects placed in it. On such a morning, if you climb the ridge behind the old Whitfield property on the back 40 acres of Madison County, North Carolina, and look down at the right moment, you can still see it. Not the system itself, the glass is gone. The frames rotted out one by one over the decades, each one failing in its own season, until the last of them disappeared sometime in the years when the people who knew what they were for were no longer alive to maintain them. The rye went to wild grass, and the wild grass gave way to the slow, woody plants that take over when nobody is tending, and those plants are going in their own time to whatever comes next. But the outline is still there. A rectangle slightly elevated above the slope around it, the deck still holding its plane against the long pull of gravity and weather and time. And in the October light, when the shadows are long and every contour of the land becomes readable, in a way it isn't at other times of year, you can see the shape of a decision made in November of 1892 by a 23-year-old woman with $11 in her coat pocket and a clear understanding of what a roof was actually for. And sometimes in the right season, in the low autumn light, you can see green up there. Thin blades, pale and new. Growing from soil that has not been tended in over 100 years in a place where nobody planted anything on a roof that has not been a working roof in longer than most people in Madison County have been alive. The rye comes back. It has been coming back every autumn since 1892, without being asked, following a rhythm established in the first weeks of that November, and never interrupted, not even after the woman who seeded it left for good, not even after the glass squares came down one by one, not even now when the deck is mostly wild and the cabin below it stands empty and the fire in the fireplace has not been lit in decades. It comes back because that is what winter rye does, when the conditions are right and the root structure has been established long enough to become part of the soil itself. The roots hold the soil holds what it has been given. And what it has been given in this case was the work of a woman who understood from the beginning that the most durable things are not the things built to last, but the things built to live. This is where it started. Go back to November of 1892. Go back to a Tuesday morning in the Whitfield house in the valley, the main house with its white clapboard siding and its 2 chimneys and its 8 rooms, and the particular quality of silence that settles into a house when something has happened that everyone in it knows about and nobody in it is prepared to discuss directly. Eli Whitfield had been dead for 6 weeks. He had been dead since September, since a morning that began ordinarily and ended with a knock at the door and a man standing in it with his hat in his hands and the particular expression that men wear when they have been asked to carry information they did not choose to carry. He had been thrown from a horse on the ridge path in the early morning. He had not gotten up. By the time anyone found him, the morning had moved on to midday, and the information that Eli Whitfield was gone from the world was already a fact rather than a possibility. Mara had been 23 years old when she married him. She was still 23 when he died. That is a narrow window in which to build a life, and a narrower one still in which to lose it. But she had not married Eli Whitfield for the security of it, or for the name, or for the house in the valley with its 8 rooms and its 2 chimneys. She had married him because he was the kind of man who kept a hand plane so sharp you could see your own face in the iron if you tilted it toward the light, and she had understood from the first time she watched him work that a man who kept his tools that way had something in him that was worth knowing. She had been right about that. She had been right about most things when it came to Eli. And she had been right about the family, too, in ways she had not entirely allowed herself to acknowledge until she was living inside the fact of it. The 6 weeks between September and November had been weeks of careful management. Caleb Whitfield, Eli's father, was 63 years old and had the particular quality of a man who understood more than he said and said less than he could have, and had spent a lifetime using the gap between those two things as a kind of insulation against consequences he did not want to face. He was not a bad man. Mara had never thought of him as a bad man. He was a man shaped by decades of managing a family and a farm and a position in Madison County by the practice of addressing things indirectly, and his indirect methods had served him well enough that he had never been forced to develop any other kind. He had offered in the weeks following Eli's death everything that politeness required, and nothing that would cost him anything lasting. He had given her the room at the back of the house. He had made sure she ate. He had spoken to her in the careful way of a man who is aware that he is being observed and wants to be seen doing the right thing, which is a different motivation from actually wanting to do the right thing, and the difference between the two is visible to anyone paying attention. Mara had been paying attention since the first Sunday dinner she attended in this house 3 years before, when Caleb had looked at a point slightly to the left of her face every time she spoke, and she had understood that he was a man who found direct eye contact from a woman disconcerting in a way he had never been required to examine. Delia Whitfield was a different matter. Delia was Gideon's wife, Gideon being Eli's older brother, and Delia was 41 years old and had been managing the Whitfield household's interior arrangements for long enough that she understood every current in it and had developed considerable skill in directing those currents without appearing to touch them. She was pleasant. She was consistently, carefully, impenetrably pleasant. Her pleasantness had a texture to it that Mara had noticed from the first, smooth as a painted surface, telling you nothing about what lay underneath, and requiring nothing of you except that you accept it at face value and behave accordingly. In the 6 weeks following Eli's death, Delia's pleasantness had taken on a specific and functional quality. It organized things, it distributed the household's attention in particular directions, and withheld it from others. It created, through the accumulation of small, consistent actions, the steady and unspoken understanding that the room at the back of the house was a temporary arrangement, that the situation had a direction it was moving in, and that the direction was outward. None of this was said. None of it needed to be. On a Tuesday morning in November, Caleb came to the back room and stood in the doorway with an envelope in his hand. He held it out. He said that the back 40 had been in the family since his father's time, and that the deed was clear, and that she should have it. He said it the way a man says something he has rehearsed, with the words landing in the right order, but the feeling behind them kept carefully separate from the words themselves. Mara took the envelope. She opened it. She read the deed once completely, the way you read a legal document when you understand that every word in it is a word that matters. Then she folded it along its original creases and put it in the pocket of her coat. She did not say anything immediately. What she understood reading that deed in the back room of the Whitfield house on a Tuesday morning in November of 1892 was not what Caleb intended her to understand. Or perhaps it was exactly what he intended delivered through the machinery of indirection that he had always preferred. The back 40 had a cabin on it. The cabin had been standing since 1849. The cabin had no roof. The original cedar shake had come down in 1884 when the pole frame rotted through, and in the 8 years since then, nobody had replaced it because the back 40 was too far from the main house to be useful for anything, and a roofless cabin in the back 40 of a working farm was not a problem that demanded solving when there were other problems closer and more pressing. What Caleb was giving her was a piece of land with a ruined structure on it. What Caleb was doing, and through the mechanism of this gift, was concluding the family's obligation to her in a way that was legal and documented and could not be argued with and would not require anyone to say anything unkind out loud. She was being given a way out that was also a way off the property. The gift and the dismissal were the same gesture, and the elegance of it, if elegance was the right word, which she was not sure it was, lay in the fact that it could be accepted or refused, but it could not be challenged without challenging the generosity itself, and challenging the generosity of a man who had just lost his son and was giving you property was not a thing that could be done without cost. She understood all of this in the time it took to fold the deed and put it in her pocket. She thanked Caleb. She meant it, though not for the reason he expected. She thanked him because the deed, whatever its intent, was real. The land was real. The cabin walls, roofless as they were, had been standing for 43 years in the Blue Ridge Mountains. And that was not nothing. That was, in fact, a very specific kind of something. Caleb nodded. He looked at a point slightly to the left of her face. He said she could take what she needed from the house. Then something happened that she had not expected. He left the doorway for a moment and came back with a canvas roll in one hand and a wooden box in the other. She recognized them before he set them down. The canvas roll was Eli's chisel set. The wooden box held the brace and bits, the draw knife, the mallet, the marking gauge, the hand plane that Eli had bought the year they married, and kept in a condition that was less maintenance than devotion, the iron ground so fine that the light ran along it like water. Caleb set them on the floor beside her trunk and did not explain why he had brought them to her, instead of leaving them with Gideon, who was the other son and who had his own set of tools, but who would have used these, would have worked them until the edge was gone and the handles were roughed up, and the particular care that Eli had put into them over years of patient attention had been eroded back to ordinary. He set them down and left. Mara stood in the back room and looked at the tools for a long time. Somewhere in the house she was aware of Delia, and she understood that Delia had seen this or would be told about it, and that it meant something to Delia that it did not mean to Caleb, because Caleb had done it without thinking too carefully about what it meant. And Delia thought carefully about everything. What Delia would make of it, what she would do with what it meant, Mara did not know and did not spend energy trying to calculate. She packed the tools into her trunk alongside the quilts and the clothing and the seed stock she had kept from her grandmother Bertie's last harvest, the winter rye selected over 40 years for germination and cold, that stopped other seeds entirely kept in a cloth sack that still smelled faintly of the Yancey County house where she had grown up. She was 23 years old. She had $11 folded in the lining of her coat. She had her grandmother's voice in her head and her husband's tools in her trunk in a deed to 40 acres in the back country of Madison County, with a four-walled roofless cabin on it that had been built in 1849 by a man who understood that the mountains did not accommodate carelessness. That was what she had. She decided it was enough. The path from the main house to the back 40 took 20 minutes on dry ground. It took 30 that afternoon because the leaves were wet and packed together on the slope, and twice she went down on one knee before she found her footing again. She was 23 years old, and she had grown up in Yancey County climbing the same kind of ridge, and she knew better than to hurry on wet leaves. But she was thinking about the cabin and not entirely about her feet, and the mountain reminded her twice that divided attention on wet ground was a form of optimism that the terrain did not reward. She was thinking about Bertie. Bertie had been dead for 6 years, but she was the kind of person whose absence occupies space in the way their presence did, filling the same dimensions, speaking in the same cadences present in every situation that bears on the knowledge they spent their lifetime accumulating. Bertie had spent 60 years watching how things grew in the mountain hollows of Appalachia, watching how the people who had been here longest handled cold and hunger, and the particular relentlessness of a winter that came early and stayed until April without apology. She had talked about what she observed the way some people talk about weather or about scripture constantly, and with the absolute conviction of someone who had tested what she believed against the available evidence and found it sound. Not the sound of theory, the sound of a fence post that doesn't move when you push it. Roots hold soil, Bertie had said, sitting at the kitchen table in the Yancey County house with her hands wrapped around a coffee cup, saying it the way she said most things she considered important, which was without ceremony as a fact that had been established long enough that it didn't require introduction. Soil holds heat. That is all a roof needs to be if you start from what a roof is actually for, which is not keeping out the rain only, keeping in the warmth. And dirt does that better than wood does if you put enough of it on and give it something alive to hold it together. Bertie had known this because her grandmother had known it, and her grandmother had learned it from the women in the hollow where she grew up, who had learned it from the generation before them, the generation that had settled the high country of western North Carolina with nothing they couldn't carry, who had learned from first principles how to stay alive in a mountain winter without the materials the lowland settlements assumed were available. The knowledge was old. It had been passed down not through books, but through the specific kind of conversation that happens between women working alongside each other, which preserves information differently than written records do, less precise in terminology, more precise in application. Mara had absorbed it the way children absorb things before they understand they are learning, without effort, without retention as an act of will, without even recognizing it as knowledge, until the moment the situation arrived that made it necessary. She heard Bertie's voice clearly when she came around the last bend of the path, and the cabin opened up in front of her for the first time as a place she was going to have to live in rather than a feature of the landscape she had been passing for years. She stopped and looked at it straight on. The first thing she noticed was the chimney. 43 years of mountain weather had done nothing to it. The stones Caleb's father had pulled from the creek bed in 1849 still sat tight in their mortar, still drew a clean line from the north wall, up into the November sky, still channeled whatever burned below, up and out, with the efficiency of something built correctly the first time and never given reason to fail. A chimney that still worked after 4 decades of standing alone in the Blue Ridge Mountains was not a minor thing. Everything else about a structure could be rebuilt. A chimney either worked or it didn't. This one worked. The walls were tulip poplar. She could tell from 20 yards by the color and the texture of bark still showing in places along the lower courses. Gray-brown furrowed the wood beneath it, dense and close-grained in the way that tulip poplar becomes after decades of settling. Each log was at least 14 inches in diameter, more on some of the lower courses. They had been notched and stacked the way men built things in 1849, when they built things to last rather than to sell, each course tight against the one below it, the original chinking of clay and dried moss gone hard as fired brick over the decades. She walked the perimeter before she went inside. She pressed her palm flat against the north wall and pushed. Nothing moved. She went to the south wall and did the same. Nothing. The east wall, where the logs were shorter because of the doorway, nothing. By the time she pressed her palm against the west wall, she already knew what she would find, which was exactly what she found 43 years of mountain winters, pushing on it from the outside and the wall giving them nothing in return. She went through the doorway and stood inside and looked up. The sky was the color of pewter. Low and flat, the particular November sky of the southern Appalachians that comes in around the first week of the month and stays until April and gives you nothing to read in it. No cloud formations, no weather systems tracking across, just a uniform gray pressure sitting on top of the mountains like a judgment that has already been delivered. It was this sky that framed itself in the open top of the cabin wall, 16 feet by 20 feet of it, and Mara stood on the puncheon floor and looked up at it for a long time without moving. The floor was split logs laid flat side up, the bark stripped, and the wood plane smooth enough to stand on without catching a splinter. It had been exposed to weather since 1884. 8 years of rain and frost had worked on it, but chestnut and tulip poplar held to weather in ways that softer woods did not. When she crouched down and pressed her knuckle hard against the grain, it did not give. She stood and walked the length of it, and the floor did not flex under her weight. It was sound. The whole structure was sound, 4 walls of floor and a chimney, and above them, nothing but 40 feet of pewter sky coming down on everything. She was standing in a problem. But the problem had a shape, and a problem with a shape was not the same thing as a problem without one. She slept at the main house one more night. She lay in the back room and did not sleep. Not truly, but lay in the particular suspended state of a mind that is working through something it has already decided and is now sequencing the steps. The arithmetic had taken most of the walk home. Now it took the hours between dark and the gray, coming at the window, and by the time the light changed, she had the order of operations in her head, and the thing was no longer a plan, but a sequence which was different. A plan was a thing you made when you weren't sure. A sequence was a thing you ran when you were. The sequence was a ladder first, then the poles, then the decking, then the bark, then the earth, then the seed. In that order and no other, because each step was the foundation of the next, and you could not work backward from the seed any more than you could work backward from any other living thing. In the morning, she told Caleb she would move to the cabin that day. He said she could take what she needed from the barn. She said she needed the axe and the splitting maul, a ladder if there was one, and the window sash she had seen stored in the back corner of the barn, the old one, the one with the glass still in it. Caleb said she could have all of it. He said it looking at a point slightly to the left of her face the way he always did, and she understood it now, not as rudeness, but as the particular difficulty of a man who is feeling something that has no name in his vocabulary and is hoping to get through the conversation without being required to name it. She moved the trunk and the tools and the things from the barn in 2 trips. The first trip she made before noon, the trunk on the borrowed handcart, the axe and maul and her coat and the seed stock. The second trip she made in the afternoon when the light was starting to thin and get long and the cold was settling into the valley the way it did in November, not dramatically, but with the patient certainty of something that knows it has the whole winter ahead of it. On the second trip, she carried the window sash on her back. When she came through the cabin doorway and set the sash down against the east wall and straightened up and looked at the open sky one last time, she felt something different from what she had felt the day before. The day before, standing in the same spot with the pewter sky pressing down through the open walls, She had felt something that she would not have called despair, but that lived in the same neighborhood, the sensation of standing inside a problem so large it had no visible edges. What she felt now was different. She felt the particular clarity that comes when a problem has been reduced to its components, and the components are finite, and the work required to address each one is known. There was no uncertainty in it. There was only sequence. And sequence was something she understood how to run. She built the ladder on the 1st of November, two straight saplings for the rails, cross rungs of hickory mortised through and wedged tight with dry oak wedges that would swell in damp weather and grip harder the wetter it got. 8 rungs spaced 15 inches apart, which put the top rung 2 feet above the top course of the walls when she leaned it against the east side. She built it in 2 hours using Eli's brace and bits for the mortise holes and his mallet to drive the wedges, and she tested it by climbing to the top and standing on the highest rung and loading it, deliberately shifting her weight down through her heels, bouncing once, twice, and the ladder did not flex and the rungs did not speak, and she climbed back down and went to the slope to start on the poles. She needed 12. She chose tulip poplar because there was no shortage of it on the slope above the cabin. Tulip poplar at 6 inches in diameter had the combination of length and stiffness. She needed enough span to cross the 16-foot width of the cabin without excessive sag, but not so heavy she couldn't manage one end while the other rested on the wall. She had worked this out in the night lying in the back room. The weight, the span, the method of getting each pole from the ground to the top of the wall alone, and the technique she would use, which was to stand each pole upright against the wall first, and then walk it up in short increments, shifting her grip up the pole as it rose until she could lever the top end over the wall plate and let gravity take it down onto the opposite side. She felled each tree with the axe working from the downhill side, cutting the notch first, and then the back cut, stepping to the side when the tree went, because a tulip poplar does not always fall where you plan it to fall, and she had grown up in logging country and had seen what happened to the people who stood where a falling tree might swing. She limed each pole on the ground, stripped the bark with Eli's draw knife, and cut it to 18 feet, 2 feet of overhang on each side of the 16-foot span. 18 feet of tulip poplar at 6 inches in diameter weighed close to 120 pounds. The 5th pole was the one that caused trouble. She had it 3/4 of the way up the wall, shifting her grip in the sequence she had established. 2 hands high, rock, the base shift, stabilize, repeat. When her left foot slipped on a patch of wet leaves she had not noticed at the base of the east wall, and she went down on one knee and the pole swung left, and the far end came off the wall lip, and the whole 120 pounds came down, and the midsection caught her right forearm with the full weight behind it. She lay on the ground for a moment with the pole across her arm and assessed the damage by flexing each finger individually. Everything moved. It was not broken. But the forearm had taken a blow deep enough that the bruise was already forming as she stood up, and by evening the arm from the wrist to the elbow was the color of a thunderhead moving in from the west. And the next morning when she picked up the draw knife to work the notches, she had to stop twice and press the forearm against the cold stone of the north wall and wait for the throbbing to subside before she could continue. She kept working. The notching took longer than the felling. Each pole needed a saddle notch at both ends cut to the exact radius of the top course log so the pole would seat down into the wall rather than simply resting on top of it. The difference between a frame that moved in wind and one that didn't was exactly this: whether the poles were locked into the walls or merely balanced on them, and she cut each notch with the draw knife and the largest chisel in Eli's set, testing the fit by lowering the pole into position and looking for light between the notch and the log below. When she saw light, she took the pole back down and cut more. When the fit was right, she drove a hickory pin through each end. 1 pin per wall, bearing the pin going down through the pole and into the top course log and locking the two together. She carved each pin from a hickory branch, shaping it slightly tapered so that it would drive tight and bind as it seated, not pull loose under lateral load. She had learned this not from any book or any single conversation, but from accumulated observation. The way she had learned most things that mattered by watching people who were good at them and paying enough attention to understand not just the action, but the reason behind it. 12 poles, 2 days of felling and moving, 3 days of notching and pegging. At the end of the 5th day, she climbed the ladder and ran her hand along the top of the outermost pole, feeling it sit in its notches locked by the hickory pins, and noticed something she had not engineered, but recognized immediately as useful: a slight natural crown in each pole, a 2-inch rise from the ends to the midspan, produced by the poles sagging fractionally under their own weight in the day since she had set them. The crown would push water toward the walls rather than letting it pool at the center of the span. She had not planned this. The poles had done it themselves. She noted it the way Bertie had told her to note things that happened in the natural course of materials, doing what materials did not as luck but as information about how the system wanted to behave. Information you could use if you were paying attention. The decking came from the chestnut tree. The tree had come down in 1884, the same year the original roof had failed, and it had been lying where it fell for 8 years. 30 feet of it intact from butt to the first branch, the main trunk undisturbed on the ground on the north side of the cabin. Caleb had mentioned it the way he mentioned the missing roof, as a condition rather than a resource, acknowledging the fact without assigning it any significance. Chestnut did not rot. Every person in Madison County old enough to have handled wood knew this. A chestnut log could lie on the ground for 20 years and still yield sound timber when you split it open, because chestnut carried something in its grain that other woods did not, a resistance to the fungi that broke everything else down over time. The reason the old-timers had used it for fence posts and sill logs and anything that lived in contact with damp ground. 8 years was nothing. The tree had been lying there seasoning. She walked its length twice before she started splitting, reading the grain, planning the cuts where the splits would run true, where the grain wandered, how to get the most width from each plank without fighting the wood's natural direction. She split the trunk lengthwise first, working the iron wedges with the maul along the heartwood, and the chestnut parted cleanly, the heartwood dark red-brown and fragrant, even after 8 years on the forest floor, without a trace of softness in it. She split each half again, then again. She rived the planks to 3 inches thick and as wide as the grain allowed, most of them 8 to 10 inches across, and carried them up the ladder 2 at a time, walking them into position across the poplar poles and fitting them tight against each other from one wall to the other. When the decking was laid, she stood on it for the first time and felt the structure under her feet, not flexing, not speaking, just present the way old wood is present, with the dense immobility of something that has been in the world long enough to have stopped moving. She jumped once. The deck did not answer. She jumped again. Nothing shifted. Then she melted pine pitch. She had collected it from the scarred trunks on the ridge above the cabin, amber and sticky where old wounds in the bark had bled and hardened over years. Each scar a record of some previous damage the tree had sealed over and incorporated. She melted it in a tin can over a fire she built in the cabin fireplace. The first fire in that hearth in 8 years, the chimney drawing perfectly from the first match, which told her everything she needed to know about the quality of the original construction, and poured it hot and liquid into the gaps between the chestnut planks, moving fast before it cooled and it hardened to a seal that was waterproof and faintly fragrant, and turned the plank deck into a single continuous surface that would shed water without deliberation. The birch bark came from a stand of paper birch half a mile up the ridge. The trees were mature, 18 inches in diameter, and the outer bark peeled in sheets as wide as her arm span when she scored each trunk vertically with the draw knife and worked her fingers under the edge. Great pale papery sheets slightly curved from the tree's circumference, cool and slightly waxy, under her palms. She took only the outer bark. This was important. She left the living cambium beneath intact, which meant the trees would survive the harvest and close over the wound within a season or two, and the stand would be available for harvest again if she needed it. Bertie had taught her this not as a rule, but as a principle you could take from a system repeatedly if you took correctly, and it would keep giving. But if you took everything, you ended the system and with it the future harvests. The distinction between taking and taking everything was the difference between a resource and a ruin, and the people who had lived in these mountains longest had understood this long before anyone wrote it down. She warmed the bark sheets by the fire to flatten them, pressing each one under boards while it cooled so it held its new shape. Then she laid them over the chestnut decking in overlapping courses, starting from the bottom edge of the roof, the south edge toward the valley, and working upward toward the ridge, each sheet lapping the one below it by 4 inches. The natural oils in the birch bark gave it a water resistance of its own before anything else went on top. She secured each sheet with wooden pegs driven through the bark and into the decking spaced a foot apart along the overlapping edges. When she had the bark down, she stood on it and jumped twice. The sheets did not shift. The pegs held. The earth required the most thought. Not the labor, though the labor was considerable, but the thought, because the earth was the element that would either make the system work or fail to make it work. And what it was made of and how deep she laid it were not matters that could be adjusted after the fact. This was the one decision in the construction sequence that could not be corrected. She dug the mixture from three sources. Creek bottom clay from the branch that ran along the south edge of the back 40, heavy and plastic, carrying the minerals of the creek bed with a cohesion when wet that nothing else in the forest provided. She carried it in buckets, 4 trips down and 4 trips back each morning before the light was full. Rotted leaf mold from the north-facing slope above the cabin, where the leaves had been accumulating and decomposing for years, dark, fine-textured, rich, with the byproducts of slow biological work, smelling of the forest floor after rain. And aged manure from the abandoned cow pen behind the cabin, the fence still standing on 3 sides, the material inside it weathered to a texture that bore no resemblance to its origin, broken down into something that was simply earth of a particular kind, with a nitrogen content that would matter when the roots came. She mixed it in a pit she dug beside the east wall, turning it with a flat-bladed spade until the consistency was even throughout. She tested it the way Bertie had taught her to test soil, by making a ball in her palm and opening her hand and watching what the ball did. It held its shape for a moment, then crumbled. Cohesion without compaction. That was what she wanted. She calculated the weight carefully, starting from what the walls could carry and working back from there. 14-inch tulip poplar logs stacked 20 courses walls that had held mountain winters for 43 years without moving when pushed. They could carry more than 4,000 pounds without structural concern. The snow load in a serious January would approach that on its own, and these walls had been built for exactly that kind of January by a man who had done the same calculation in 1849 and had not underestimated it. She spread the earth 6 inches deep across the entire deck, working from the center outward, so the weight distributed evenly across the poles. She used the flat of the spade to level it, reading the surface the way you read a planting bed, looking for low spots where water would pull, filling them, reading again. When she was done, she pushed her hand into the soil and felt the temperature at the bottom of the 6-inch layer. It was warmer than the air above it, not by much, not dramatically, but by several degrees, which was enough to understand that the earth itself was already doing what she had been told it would do, insulating the mass below it from the cold pressing down from above. The ground was not frozen. It would not freeze easily. 6 inches of living earth did not freeze the way a 1/4 inch of topsoil froze, because there was too much mass to it, and mass held what it was given. She pulled her hand from the soil and stood on the deck and looked at the completed surface in the last of the November light. 4 walls, a floor, a chimney, a deck of chestnut planks on poplar poles sealed with birch bark and pine pitch, covered with 6 inches of mixed Appalachian earth. And above it, for the first time in 8 years, not the open pewter sky, but a surface and actual boundary between inside and outside, between the space where the fire burned and the space where the November cold was doing what November cold in the Blue Ridge always did, which was to make itself known without apology. She seeded the rye on the 15th of November. She had saved the seed from Bertie's last stores, the same variety her grandmother had grown for a generation, selected over 4 decades for early germination and cold tolerance. She broadcast it by hand, walking the deck in a grid, scattering the grain in overlapping arcs, the way she had watched Bertie scatter it every fall of her childhood. She raked it in lightly with the garden rake she had taken from Caleb's barn, pressing seed into contact with the soil without burying it too deep. Then she carried water up from the branch, 2 full buckets for the 320 square feet of deck, enough to settle the seed into the soil without waterlogging it. Bertie had said once that winter rye was the honest crop. It made no promises it didn't keep. It would germinate in cold that stopped other seeds. It would put its roots down before the ground froze hard and come back in spring without being asked. Not the most productive grain, not the easiest to work with, but in the mountains where the growing season was short and the winters were long and the weather accommodated no one's plans, honest was worth more than productive. Mara wrapped herself in the two quilts she had brought from her trunk and lay down near the fireplace. The cabin was warm, genuinely evenly warm, not just warm near the fire. The walls radiated in the modest way of thick old wood that has absorbed a day's heat and is giving it back slowly. The new earth roof above the chestnut planks held what the fire sent up, and what the fire sent up became part of a conversation between the warmth below and the cold above, conducted through 6 inches of soil and birch bark and chestnut, each material contributing what it had to the common work of keeping the space habitable. She had not slept well in 6 weeks. She closed her eyes. The fire settled to coals. Outside, the November cold of Madison County did what it always did, which was to make everything in its reach temporary and small. Inside, the new-built warmth held on. She slept the whole night through. 6 days later, the 21st of November. Early morning before the light was fully established, when the world was still that particular shade of pre-dawn gray that exists in the mountains when the sky and the ridgelines are barely distinguishable from each other. Mara climbed the ladder. She had been up each morning since the seeding, checking the surface for moisture content, for evidence of settling, for any sign of the birch bark giving way at the joints, for any of the dozen ways that a newly built system declares its imperfections in the days immediately following its completion. Each morning the surface had been, as she left it, dark damp in the places it should be damp, holding its temperature against the outside cold, producing no surprises in either direction. This morning was different. She came over the top of the ladder and straightened up and looked at the surface of the deck in the thin early light, and she stopped. Green. Not much. Not even what you would call a presence exactly. Thin blades pale as new grass, almost translucent in the low light, pushing up from the dark soil in clusters, wherever the seed had made good contact with the moisture below scattered across the surface, in the uneven distribution of a hand broadcast, denser in some areas, absent in others, but present, unmistakably present, unmistakably alive. It was the 21st of November. The slope below the cabin was brown. The ridgeline above it was bare gray against a pewter sky. Every other surface in the visible world had given up on growing anything until spring. The valley below was the particular dead color of late autumn in the southern mountains, which is not a sad color so much as an honest one. The landscape doing what it does when the season requires it, neither resisting nor dramatizing the necessity. And here on the roof of a cabin in the back 40 of the Whitfield property in Madison County, North Carolina, in the second week of November in the year 1892, there was green. Mara stood on the top rung of the ladder with her forearms resting on the edge of the deck and looked at the green shoots for a long time without moving. She thought about Bertie. She thought about the kitchen table in the Yancey County house and the coffee cup and the particular voice of a woman who had spent 60 years watching how things grew and had talked about what she saw with the certainty of a person whose observations had been tested against everything the mountains could bring. She thought about how long it takes for knowledge to travel from one person to another. Not the kind that can be written down and transmitted efficiently, but the kind that has to be demonstrated, has to be pointed at, has to be seen and recognized in a moment when the circumstances have made you ready to see it. She had been ready. She had been ready since she stood in the roofless cabin 6 weeks before and looked up at the pewter sky and heard Bertie's voice tell her what a roof was actually for. The green held. Over the nights that followed, nights when the temperature dropped into the upper 20s and the frost came down hard on everything in the valley, when the ground outside the cabin was white and stiff, and the cold had the determined quality of a thing that knows it has arrived for the season, the rye did not die back. It did not retreat. It pushed another half-inch and then another, thin and pale but alive in a way that everything on the surrounding slopes was not. Because 6 inches of earth does not freeze. Not in the way that a quarter-inch of topsoil freezes. Not with the whole weight of the mountain below it conducting heat upward through the cabin walls and the poplar poles and the chestnut planking into the soil above. The fire in the fireplace heated the air inside. The hot air rose to the ceiling. The chestnut planks conducted the heat upward into the earth above. And the earth held it slowly, evenly, without announcement, the way soil holds anything it has been given enough time to absorb. The cabin was heating the roof, and the roof was growing. Mara stood on the ground below the cabin one afternoon in late November and looked up at what she had built. From the outside, standing back far enough to see the full profile, it looked like any other mountain cabin with a roof, because it had a roof. 6 inches of dark Appalachian earth on birch bark, on chestnut planks, on poplar poles, on poplar walls that had been holding their ground since 1849. She had $11. She had Eli's tools. She had 4 walls and a floor, and a chimney that worked, and 6 inches of earth being warm from below by the cabin it was keeping warm from above. She had green thin as a whisper growing on a rooftop in November, while everything else in Madison County went dormant and brown. She did not think yet about what it would become. She was 23 years old, and she had been widowed in September and had moved to a roofless cabin in November, and had spent every day since the first of the month doing physical work that would have taxed someone twice her size. She was tired in the specific way that comes from sustained effort rather than crisis, the good tired, the kind that means you have been spending yourself on something that required everything you had to give. She let the fire burn down to coals. She wrapped herself in her quilts and closed her eyes. Above the chestnut planks, 6 inches of dark Appalachian soil held the warmth it had been given. The rye roots held the soil. The thin green blades held on against the cold. And across the hollow on the opposing ridge, in a cabin whose firelight showed faint as a coal through the darkness of the November mountain, a man named Edmund Voss had been watching through a brass spyglass with a cracked lens for 3 weeks, cataloging in his 19th notebook the behavior of a thing he could not yet classify. He had seen the green that morning. He had put the spyglass down. He had picked it up and looked again. The green was still there. He had set the spyglass down a second time and sat at his table for a long while looking at his cold coffee, thinking about the last 61 years of watching how things grew in Madison County and trying to recall a single instance of anything he had seen through that cracked amber lens that he could not eventually name. He could not recall one. He put on his coat. He laced his boots. He came down off the ridge. He did not know yet what it would become either, but he was already on his way to find out. Edmund Voss had been keeping notebooks since he was 19 years old. Not journals, not diaries. He had no interest in the record of his own interior life, which he considered a poor subject compared to the world outside it. What he kept were observation logs, precise dated, accumulated over 4 decades of watching Madison County from the ridge where his father had built the cabin he now lived in, alone cataloging what grew where and in what season, tracking the behavior of weather systems by the movement of the tree canopy, noting the first appearance of species in spring and their disappearance in fall, with the attention of a man who understood that observation without record was simply looking, and looking without record left nothing behind when the observer was gone. He had filled 18 notebooks this way. Nobody had asked to see them. He had kept filling them regardless, because the act of recording was not about the audience. It was about the accuracy. A thing written down precisely was a thing that existed independently of memory, which was unreliable, and independently of the observer, which was temporary. The notebooks would outlast him. That was the point. The spyglass had come from his father, who had carried it through 2 years of the war and brought it home with a crack across the objective lens that did not affect the magnification, but gave everything seen through it a faint amber cast, as though the world at a distance was slightly warmer than the world at close range, slightly more golden, slightly more worth looking at. Edmund had used it for 40 years and no longer noticed the amber. It was simply the color of the far distance. He had been watching Mara Whitfield for 3 weeks before the green appeared. In that time, he had filled 6 pages of his 19th notebook with attempts to classify what she was doing. He had seen the ladder go up against the east wall on the 1st of November. He had watched her ascending and descending it with increasing frequency in the days that followed. He had observed material being moved to the top of the wall's poles, first carried up individually in a technique he could see but not entirely follow at 400 yards through the amber lens, then flat sections of something, then what appeared to be sheets of pale material that might have been bark. He could not determine what she was building. This was unusual. In 61 years of watching how people in Madison County solved the problems the mountains presented, Edmund Voss had not encountered many things he could not classify. He had a broad and deeply indexed catalog of human ingenuity in the face of Appalachian conditions, and it was organized not by category so much as by principle, by the underlying logic of what each solution was trying to accomplish. Most things seen from sufficient distance reduced to their principles clearly enough to name. This did not. He watched for 3 more days. He added 2 more pages of notes, each entry more tentative than the last, each concluding with a variant of the same admission, insufficient data. On the 6th day, he considered going down to ask. He did not go. He kept watching because there was something in the accumulation of what he was seeing that told him if he watched long enough, the logic would reveal itself, and a thing understood by sustained observation was understood in a different and deeper way than a thing explained by the person doing it. Then the green appeared. He had trained the spyglass on the roof at first light on the 22nd of November in the 40-minute window when the low morning sun hit the south-facing surface at an angle that made its texture readable through the amber lens. He had done this every clear morning for 2 weeks, watching for changes in the surface, watching for the behavior of whatever material she had laid down. What he saw that morning was color where there had been no color. Green. Faint, scattered, unmistakably alive, distributed across the dark surface of the roof in the pattern he recognized without having to think about it, because he had been watching things germinate in Madison County for 6 decades, and the pattern of new germination was as familiar to him as his own handwriting. Not established growth. The specific scattered green of seeds that had cracked open and sent up their first blades within the past day or two. He put the spyglass down. He picked it up and looked again. The green was still there. He set the glass down a second time and sat at his table and looked at his cold coffee and thought about what a man does when he encounters the one thing in 61 years of careful observation that he cannot place. He thought about the implications of germination on a rooftop in the 3rd week of November. He thought about what the material beneath the seeds must be and what had to be beneath that and what had to be beneath that for the seeds to have moisture and warmth sufficient to break dormancy while every other living thing in the visible world had gone still. He thought about an agricultural journal his father had kept from before the war, one of a dozen that had come with the cabin, describing construction techniques from the open plains where settlers had built with earth because earth was what they had. He thought about what he knew of sod, of thermal mass, of the specific heat of soil versus wood versus still air. He thought about the chimney he had been watching every morning for 3 weeks, the thread of smoke rising from the north end of that cabin, consistent and moderate. Not the smoke of a fire that was being used for warmth alone, but the smoke of a fire being managed by someone who understood what a steady draw meant and what an unsteady one indicated. He understood, sitting at his table with his cold coffee, that what he was looking at was not the same as sod construction. It was more deliberate than that, more layered, more considered. There was a sequence to it that he could now, with the evidence of the green trace backward, through what he had observed, and the sequence made a logic that he had not seen before, not in any journal, or any conversation, or any 61 years of watching how people lived on these ridges. He put on his coat, he laced his boots, he came down off the ridge. The knock came at mid-morning. Mara opened the door and looked at him, a man of 61, lean and weathered in the way of men who spend most of their time outdoors and have long since stopped making accommodations to weather, with a canvas-covered notebook under one arm and the spyglass hanging from a strap around his neck, the brass worn to a muted gold at every contact point. She did not fill the silence with the first available words. She simply looked at him with the particular attention of someone who was reading a situation before responding to it. The spyglass told her most of what she needed to know. "How long have you been watching?" The question came without preamble. Edmund did not see any advantage in evasion with a person who had already deduced the relevant facts. 3 weeks. She considered this. He could see her evaluating it, not deciding whether to be angry, which she apparently had already decided against, but determining what 3 weeks of watching told her about the kind of man who would do it, whether that kind of man was someone she wanted to continue this conversation with. She reached her conclusion. "Coffee's on the fire." He came inside. The warmth was the first thing he registered, not the aggressive heat of a room with too large a fire and too small a space, but an even distributed warmth that seemed to come from the walls themselves as much as from the fireplace. He stood near the fire and looked up at the chestnut plank ceiling and thought about what was above it. He had spent enough time in poorly insulated mountain cabins to know the difference between a cabin that was warm near the fire and cold 3 feet from it and one that was warm throughout. This one was the latter. He looked at the ceiling again. Then he looked at her. "That's winter rye." He said it the way a man says something he has been working toward for several weeks and has finally arrived at not reciting a conclusion, but landing on one, the words carrying the weight of the reasoning behind them. Yes. On a roof. Yes. He drank his coffee and thought about thermal mass, about the specific heat of soil, about what 6 inches of living earth held together by root structure and warmed from below by a managed fire could do to the temperature differential between a mountain cabin's interior and the November cold above it. He thought about the implications of a growing medium that was simultaneously a structural surface, an insulating layer, and a thermal battery. And he thought about the particular elegance of a system in which each function reinforced every other function. He spoke slowly, working it out as he spoke. The cabin heats the soil grows the food insulates the cabin. A pause. It's a circle. Mara poured more coffee into his cup without being asked and did not say anything, and he understood that her silence was not confirmation or denial, but something more precise, the silence of a person who has been working inside an idea long enough that having it named by someone else from the outside produces a particular kind of stillness. He looked at her directly. "May I come back in January?" "You know where I am," she said. The storm came on the 3rd of January. It came from the northwest, which was the direction the ridge behind the cabin was designed to deflect. And the ridge did what it had been doing for 43 years, absorbed the worst of the prevailing wind off the mountain, reduced it, broke its sustained push to something manageable. But the ridge could not redirect the snow itself, which arrived first horizontal and then 6 hours later, straight down, and accumulated at a rate that Mara had not seen since a hard winter in Yancey County when she was 12 years old. By the second evening, there was 2 feet of snow on the deck above, dense and wet and heavy in the way of saturated January snow, and the cabin below was warm and dry and performing exactly as she had calculated it would. She woke at 3 in the morning to the sound of water. Not rain has a distributed quality, arriving at many surfaces simultaneously, creating a broad ambient noise that tells you something about direction and intensity, but nothing about source. What she heard was specific, small, precise. The metronomic sound of individual drops falling from a single point and landing on the puncheon floor in nearly the same spot one after another, with the steady, unhurried patience of a problem that has found its way through and sees no reason to stop. She lit the oil lamp. The source was in the northeast corner of the ceiling, where water was working through a seam in the chestnut planking, pushing through the birch bark above it, coming through because the bark in that corner was thinner than elsewhere. She had used smaller pieces there, overlapping them more to compensate for the reduced width, but the overlap had not been sufficient against 2 feet of saturated snow, driving its meltwater down through the pack. She dressed. Every layer she had. She climbed the ladder with the oil lamp in one hand, which she understood was not the safest arrangement, and did it anyway because the alternative was climbing in darkness onto a snow-covered roof in the middle of a January night, and of the 2 risks she was being asked to choose between, the lamp was the one she could manage. The snow on the deck was 2 feet deep and dense. She pushed through it to the northeast corner and dug with both hands to the soil layer beneath. The soil at the leak point was waterlogged, saturated from above, the moisture working down through the snow and through the thin bark layer and pooling in the earth before finding the seam in the chestnut below. She worked in the lamplight with the wind at her back. She scooped wet snow away from the corner, exposed the saturated soil, then moved earth from the drier center of the roof out to the thin point, handfuls at a time, pressing it down and firming it with her palms. Her fingers went numb within 10 minutes. After that, she worked by feel, which was less precise than working by sight, but sufficient for what the task required. She was not doing finish work. She was adding mass and coverage to a specific location and sealing a path of least resistance that meltwater had found and would keep using until the path was closed. She was on the roof for 2 hours. When she came down and stripped her outer layers and laid them near the fire to dry, her forearms were shaking in the way that muscles shake when they have been asked for more than they were quite ready to give. She rebuilt the fire not for warmth specifically because the cabin was still warm, but for the heat that would rise through the planking and help draw the moisture out of the saturated soil above. Then she sat in her chair and watched the ceiling. The dripping stopped before dawn. In the morning, when the storm had moved east and left behind the specific silence of a world covered in new snow, That particular stillness in which sound does not travel, and the only things moving are the slow changes of light. She climbed the ladder again in the thin early light and pushed her hand into the soil at the northeast corner. It was warm, warmer in fact than the surrounding areas, warmer than any other point on the deck, because the moisture she had packed down overnight had conducted the cabin's rising heat upward more efficiently than the drier soil around it. And the result was that the place that had failed was now the place where the thermal connection between the cabin below and the soil above was most direct and most complete. The problem had become the best performing part of the system. She stayed on the roof for a while, kneeling in the packed snow at the edge of the cleared area, her hand in the warm soil of the corner that had tried to fail and had instead become something better than it was before. Across the hollow, a thin thread of smoke rose straight up from Edmund Voss's chimney in the still air. The storm was over. The pressure was holding. Everything that could be read in the visible landscape was reading clearly. She understood something on that rooftop that she had known intellectually since she had worked out the system in her head the previous in October, but had not known in her body until this moment, which is the difference between understanding a principle and understanding its implications. A system that failed by becoming more of itself could not be stopped by failure. It was not fragile in the ways that constructed things were usually fragile. It was a system that learned. The Marshall Market opened in the first week of March. Mara carried her basket lined with cloth filled with butter lettuce that she had been growing under the first glass pane since Christmas Day, 24 heads, dense and green and improbable, in a way that she had stopped finding improbable, but understood that others would not. She set the basket on the table between the dried apple vendor on her left and the space where Thessaly Marsh sold lye soap on her right. The lettuce was gone in 40 minutes. 39 cents at 3 cents a head from customers who stopped at her table with the expression of people encountering something that contradicted their understanding of what was seasonally possible and decided to simply accept the contradiction and purchase it. Nobody asked where it came from. In the first week, they simply bought it the way people buy things that are available and wanted without needing to understand the mechanism of their availability. The second week, she came back with more lettuce and the first of the spinach. Dorothy Marsh asked where the greens came from. Mara told her. Dorothy looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a woman who has heard something that requires a more extended conversation than the current situation allows. She bought 6 heads of lettuce instead of 4 and left without further comment. The trouble came on the second Saturday of March. Warren Gale was 52 years old and had been the primary commercial authority in Marshall for long enough that the habit of being deferred to had stopped being a habit and become a conviction. He ran the general merchandise on the main street, a 2-story building with a covered porch where men sat on barrels on warm days and evaluated the agricultural decisions of their neighbors. And he had operated in Madison County long enough that his assessment of any commercial situation had calcified into something he no longer questioned because it had rarely been questioned by anyone else. He approached Mara's table when her basket held 24 heads of butter lettuce, a bunch of spring onions, and a paper bag of radishes. He looked at the greens with the expression of a man who has already decided what he thinks and is now looking for confirmation that he is correct. He spoke loudly enough for the adjacent vendors to hear. That was the point, a public statement, not a private inquiry. Nobody grows lettuce in March in Madison County. He looked at the basket, then he looked at her. Where'd you really get this? Mara looked at him without any change in her expression. From my roof. He laughed. It was the laugh of a man who has decided in advance that something is absurd and is performing that decision for an audience, a laugh that required witnesses to be fully itself. Thessaly Marsh, standing at the adjacent table, offered a small, polite smile that committed to nothing. The apple vendor found something on her own table to examine. Mara picked up the 39 cents she had already taken in that morning, put it in her coat pocket, and continued selling to the customer who had been waiting behind Warren Gale. The customer was Dorothy Marsh, who bought the last 4 heads of lettuce without making eye contact with anyone. Warren Gale walked away. Mara watched the direction he went and noted it without assigning it any particular significance. She finished the market day, packed the empty basket, and walked home. The spring was coming into the lower slopes, not yet, not fully, but in the way that a change of season announces itself 2 weeks before it arrives in the quality of the light and the smell of the soil on warm afternoons. and the particular restlessness of things that have been dormant and are beginning to remember what they are for. Edmund came back on the 3rd of February, as he had said he would. He climbed the notched log ladder that Mara had leaned against the east wall and stood on the roof for the first time, and he stood there for a long time without speaking, which was his practice when he was seeing something. For the first time, he gave things time to become what they were before he began the work of naming them. What he saw was 23 square feet of cleared ground in the center of the deck. The rye cut back to the edges with its root structure intact beneath the soil, and in the cleared square, a glass pane from the old window sash, the one Mara had carried from Caleb's barn on her second trip in November, laid flat over 2-inch tall butter lettuce seedlings growing in dark warm soil while 3 inches of fresh snow sat on the surrounding deck. He could feel the warmth through the soles of his boots, not the warmth of a fire nearby. The warmth of the earth itself conducting heat that had been fed into it from below, holding it against the cold above with the patient efficiency of mass, the same principle by which a stone wall holds the day's heat into the evening, but applied here in 3 dimensions in a living system in a way that was self-reinforcing rather than simply retentive. He sat down on the deck and opened his notebook. He began to draw. He came back every week after that, and each time he came, he brought something. The first week, he brought seeds from his own stores, spinach radish, spring onion, a turnip green variety. He had been selecting for 12 years for performance in Madison County's specific conditions of elevation and rainfall and soil chemistry, each variety kept in labeled cloth envelopes in a wooden box that he had carried from the cabin with the careful handling of a man transporting something irreplaceable. He had sourced and selected these over years of patient cultivation trading seed with farmers across 3 counties, always selecting for the individual plants that perform best in this specific hollow, at this specific elevation in this specific clay-heavy mountain soil. He gave them without ceremony. Mara held each envelope up to the light, read the label, set it aside. She did not say more than was required. Neither did he. The second week, Edmund Voss came back to the Whitfield, back 40. He was carrying 4 glass panes wrapped in burlap. He brought them carefully down the ridge path in the February cold, one hand steadying the bundle against his chest, picking his way on the ice-edged stones with the deliberate attention of a man who understands the cost of a single misstep. When Mara opened the door and saw what he was carrying, she looked at the panes and then at him. "From your own cabin, the south windows." He set them down against the wall with the care of a man setting down something that has already been decided. "I've replaced them with oiled cloth on frames, lets in light of a kind, keeps out wind of a kind." He said it with the flatness of a man who had made the calculation warmth in his own cabin against the expansion of the system in hers, and found the calculation straightforward. Mara picked up each pane and held it to the light, checking for cracks. She set all 4 against the wall. Then she sat down at the chestnut table with a piece of charcoal and a flat piece of chestnut bark, and drew a grid mapping where each new square would go on the roof surface, how the rye between them would function as ground cover and windbreak, how the angles of the low winter sun would interact with the glass at each position. Edmund watched her do this. He thought about the difference between people who understand systems intuitively, who move through the logic of interconnected parts without having to name each relationship, and people who have to build the logic step by step from explicit principles. She was the former kind. He had suspected it from the amber lens in November. He was certain of it now. He was 61 years old. He had spent 4 decades looking for things worth documenting. He had found them occasionally in the behavior of plants, in weather systems, and the accumulated ingenuity of mountain people solving mountain problems. He had filled 18 notebooks with them. What he was watching now was different from any of it. He sat down across the table from her, opened his 19th notebook, and began to write. By early March, they had 11 covered growing squares on the roof. Dorothy Marsh had contributed 2 panes from a cold frame that had warped beyond repair over the winter, the glass intact though the frame was gone. A farmer named Aldous Pruitt on the French Broad had sent a section of church window, a single large pane with 1 corner missing, but covering 3 square feet of growing area, delivered by a neighbor passing through Marshall, who had heard about the roof in the way that things get heard about in small mountain counties, when they are unusual enough that the people who learn of them cannot stop mentioning them to others. Mara cleared each new square herself, pulling the rye back to the edges with her hands scratching furrows in the warm soil with a stick pressing seed in at the depth and spacing appropriate to each variety, laying the glass over the top and pressing a thin bead of earth around the edges to seal the gap. Each square became its own small climate, a column of warm soil and warmed air under glass protected from the cold above, fed by the heat below, catching the low winter sun through the south-facing exposure of the mountain slope. The spinach germinated in 11 days, the radishes in 8. The spring onions took longer because they always took longer. But by the third week of February, the first true leaves were showing pale and tentative, the particular pale of plants that have not yet had enough light to build their full color, reaching toward the February sun coming through the glass at its winter angle. By the first week of March, they were deep green and aromatic and smelling sharp. When she brushed them with her fingers, that clean, specific smell that means something edible is ahead of the season by rights. Edmund attended to the notebooks and the science of it. He measured soil temperatures at different depths, at different times of day, in different weather conditions, recording the numbers with the precision of a man who understood that the data was only as useful as the consistency of the method that collected it. He charted germination rates against soil temperatures. He drew diagrams of the cross-section cabin plank ceiling, pole frame bark, layer earth seed, and annotated them with the thermal principles at work in each layer. He was building the vocabulary for what Mara had built by instinct and inheritance. She had built the application. He was building the language that would let it travel. 2 weeks after Warrengale's performance at the market on a Tuesday morning in mid-March, when Mara was on the roof repositioning the glass squares to optimize the angle for the changing spring sun, a young man came up the back 40 path from the valley. He was about 17. He had the look of someone who has been assigned a task he is not entirely confident about and is proceeding anyway because the alternative is returning to the person who assigned it and reporting failure. He was Fletcher Gale. She knew this before he said it because she had seen Warrengale at the market, and the resemblance was clear, the same build, the same coloring, but with the uncertainty of youth on it rather than the calcification of long authority. He stopped at the base of the ladder and looked up at her. She came down. He said his father wanted to know whether she would be willing to supply the general merchandise with fresh greens on a regular basis. He delivered this information with the careful neutrality of a young man who was representing someone else's position and does not want to be held responsible for it. He had not apologized for his father. She had not expected him to and did not require it. The market was the market. What had happened there was between her and Warrengale and had nothing to do with this boy. She asked what quantity and at what interval and on what terms. Fletcher gave her the terms Warren had sent him with. She named different terms. Fletcher said he would have to go back and ask. She said that was fine. He knew where she was. He came back Thursday with an agreement that was close enough to her terms to be acceptable. She shook his hand on it because he was the one standing in front of her, and because a handshake was a handshake regardless of whose authority stood behind it. Edmund, when she told him, he was quiet for a moment. Then he opened his notebook and wrote something. She did not ask what. He had a way of responding to things that satisfied him by writing rather than speaking, which she had come to understand was not a withholding of response, but simply the form that the most genuine response took in a man who had spent 61 years learning that writing was more accurate than talking. By April, there were more people than just Warrengale's store. The Marshall Market absorbed what she could carry each Saturday without remainder. Dorothy Marsh began referring customers to her. Aldous Pruitt mentioned the system to a man in Hot Springs who mentioned it to someone in Asheville. The information moved the way information moves in mountain counties, not through any organized channel, but through the accumulated weight of individual conversations, each one passing the fact along, because the fact was unusual enough that it persisted in the mind of whoever heard it and eventually found its way to someone else. In May of 1893, Edmund Voss published an article in the Asheville Citizen. He had written it over 3 weeks in the careful, precise prose of a man who understood the difference between what he knew and what he could demonstrate and who committed to paper only the latter. He described the construction in technical detail sufficient for replication, the materials, their sources, the sequence of application, the thermal principles at each layer. He named the underlying logic of the system in language that was exact without being inaccessible. He used her name 3 times in 4 paragraphs, This was not customary in the citizen's agricultural correspondence, where attribution was typically vague or absent. He had done it deliberately because he had understood from the first week he came down off the ridge that what was happening on the Whitfield Back 40 was not a curiosity or an isolated incident, but a system, and systems deserved to be attached to the names of the people who built them. That attachment was not sentiment, it was accuracy. The system was Mara Whitfield's. The article should say so. The response came in two forms. The first was letters to the editor published the following week. One came from a man in Asheville who identified himself as having extensive experience in agricultural matters and who argued at length that sod construction of the type described could not sustain the load and temperature variation of an Appalachian winter. His argument relied entirely on assumptions about the materials that bore no relationship to what Edmund had described. He appeared to have read the article selectively and argued against a simpler version of it that existed only in his response. The second letter came from a local minister who expressed concern about the implications of a woman undertaking structural construction outside the ordinary domestic sphere. Edmund read both letters to Mara on a Tuesday afternoon. She listened to the first one with the focused attention of someone evaluating a technical argument for the validity of its reasoning. When Edmund finished reading the second one, she looked at him for a moment. Then she refilled her coffee cup and said nothing at all, which told Edmund more about what she thought of the minister's concern than any response could have. The second form of response was a man from Asheville who arrived on a Tuesday in late May. He was well-dressed for the terrain and breathing harder than he wanted to show after the walk up the back 40 path. He had written ahead introducing himself as having scientific interest in agricultural innovation, and Mara had read the letter and formed an accurate preliminary assessment of him from it. He walked the perimeter of the cabin twice. He climbed the ladder and stood on the roof and looked at what was there in its late spring condition, the rye cut back and lying as mulch between the cleared squares, the squares themselves holding beans and squash in their early stages, the broad squash leaves already large enough to shade the soil at the base of each plant. He spent 20 minutes on the roof without speaking. Then he climbed down, looked at Mara once with an expression that she recognized as the specific expression of a man whose model of the world has just been revised in a direction he did not anticipate, and walked back down the path toward Marshall without asking a single question. He did not write a follow-up letter to the citizen. His silence was its own kind of statement. Mara filed it the same way she filed most things that told her something about how the world received what she was doing, without drama, without satisfaction, as information that was useful to have and not worth spending additional energy on. It was the second Saturday of February, the same week Edmund would bring the window panes down from his own cabin, when Frances Cole found her at the market. Frances Cole was in her mid-40s and ran a small millinery operation out of her home 2 miles outside Marshall, and she was the kind of woman who believed that other women should be in possession of information relevant to their own interests. She had no particular connection to Mara and no particular stake in what she was about to say. She simply had information that she believed Mara deserved to have, and she delivered it the way she delivered most things, directly, without drama and without apparent enjoyment of it. She waited until there was a gap in the customers at Mara's table. She said that Warren Gale's store had been selling fresh greens in January and February at 8 cents a head. She said that as far as she could determine, the source of those greens was not identified on the shelf or to customers asking about them. She said she thought Mara should know this. Mara thanked her. Frances Cole nodded once and walked back to her side of the market. She had done what she came to do. Mara stood at her table and sold the remaining lettuce to the customers who came after, and she said what needed to be said to each of them, and when the last head was gone, she packed the basket and folded the cloth liner and put the coins in her coat pocket. She walked home on the valley road in the late afternoon, the February light going flat and gray across the ridges, the cold settling in from the northwest, the way it always did when the sun got low in the second month of the year. She made supper. She ate it. Then she sat down at the chestnut table, the table she had built herself from the same fallen tree that had given her the roof decking, the surface planed smooth with Eli's hand plane, and finished with linseed oil until it reflected light in the low, steady way of good wood that has been properly treated, and she sat there for a while with her hands flat on the surface. She was not deciding whether to address it. That was already decided. The terms of the arrangement with Warren Gale had been accepted in good faith and had been run in bad faith from the beginning, and the terms needed to be reset, and she was the only person who could reset them. She was deciding how. Not the confrontation itself that was simple. Walk in, state the case, present the options. The how was the framing the specific structure of the conversation that would make it possible for Warren Gale to accept terms he had not intended to accept, while still believing that what was happening was within his control. She was not interested in humiliating him. Humiliation would make him an enemy when what she needed was a reliable commercial arrangement. She needed him to move, not to break. She worked it out at the chestnut table in the February cold, the fire low and steady behind her. The solution was simple. It was almost always simple, she had found, once the emotional noise was removed from the question. You presented the facts as facts without the weight of grievance behind them, and you offered a choice that was genuinely a choice, not an ultimatum dressed as a choice, but an actual fork in the road with two actual paths. One path served both parties. The other path served neither. You let the person in front of you choose. Most people presented with a genuine choice in which one option was clearly better chose the better option. She went to bed. She had a conversation to have on Monday morning, and she needed to be rested for it. Above the chestnut planks, the 6-inch layer of Appalachian soil held the warmth from the fire below. The root structure of the rye dormant, now in the late winter, held the soil together against whatever the next night would bring. The system ran. It had been running for 4 months without interruption, through a 2-foot snowstorm, in a January freeze, in a February that had given nothing away easily. It was still running. And Mara Whitfield, 23 years old, and $12 richer than she had been in November. $12.39 to be exact, because she kept the accounts precisely lay in the dark in her cabin in the back 40 of Madison County and thought about the shape of the coming week and was not afraid of any part of it. Outside, the February cold did what February cold in the Blue Ridge Mountains always did, which was to press down hard and claim everything in its reach and offer nothing in return. Inside, the fire held, above the earth held what the fire gave it, and in the root layer, invisible and patient, the winter rye waited for the season to turn, already knowing in whatever way a plant knows things that it would. She went to Warren Gale's store on Monday morning. She went early before the day's business had fully established itself, when the porch was still empty of the men who occupied it later, and the Offram interior held only Warren behind his counter, and 2 customers finishing their transactions near the dry goods shelves. She waited at the door until those customers had concluded their business and left. Then she walked to the counter. Warren looked up. Something in his expression adjusted a small recalibration, the look of a man who was not surprised to see her, but had expected more time before this particular visit. She put a piece of paper on the counter. She had written on it the current market price for fresh greens in February in Madison County, sourced from her own observation of what customers were willing to pay at the Saturday market, and from what Frances Cole had told her about the pricing on Warren's own shelves. The numbers were accurate. She had not rounded them in any direction. She looked at him directly the way she had always looked at people who would have preferred she look somewhere else. We can do this 2 ways. Her voice had the quality of a statement rather than the opening of a negotiation. Not hostile, not theatrical, simply the voice of a person who has already determined the available options and is offering a choice rather than beginning a discussion. You continue buying from me at terms we both agree to, and you sell to your customers at a price we both agree to, and you tell them where the greens come from. A pause calibrated. Or you find another supply. She did not say what they both understood, which was that there was no other supply of fresh greens in Madison County in February, and that both of them knew this, and that the absence of that other supply was not a temporary condition that would resolve itself before spring. Warren Gale looked at the paper. He looked at her. He was not a stupid man. She had understood this from the beginning, and stupidity would in some ways have been easier to work with. He was a man whose intelligence had been operating without meaningful opposition for long enough that being opposed clearly and without apology was a genuinely new experience. He was recalculating. She could see it. He named a modified price. Not her price, but not his original price either. A position, not a destination. She named a different number. He moved. She moved less. They arrived at a figure that was higher than what she had been receiving, and lower than what he had been charging, which meant both of them were in a different position than before the conversation, and the terms were now accurate and sustainable. Sustainable was the word that mattered. She was not trying to win a battle. She was trying to establish conditions that would hold. A victory that left Warren Gale humiliated was a victory that produced a problem, an adversary with a grudge and a long memory, in a counter on the main street of Marshall. What she needed was an adversary who had been clearly outmaneuvered and knew it, but who had been given a face-saving exit within the new arrangement, so that what he told himself afterward was not that he had been beaten, but that he had been negotiated with. That was a different story, and people lived inside their stories. The following week, the name Mara Whitfield appeared on a small card on the shelf beside the greens at Gale's General Merchandise, hand-lettered in the careful script of a man who had concluded that attribution was now part of the arrangement and had decided to execute it properly rather than grudgingly. She walked home from the store in the February cold and felt something settle in her chest that had been slightly loose since she had first set her basket on the market table in Marshall, some small, persistent uncertainty about whether the thing she had built was genuinely hers in the commercial sense, as well as the physical one, about whether the value that flowed from it would find its way back to her or be redirected by the gravity of established authority toward the people who had always held it. Now she knew. The greens grew on her roof from her soil, from her seed in the system she had designed and built with her own hands and refined through 3 winters of patient observation. The price they sold for was the price she had determined they were worth. The name attached to them was her name. That was worth the coal walk. That was worth considerably more. Caleb Whitfield came on a Thursday in the second week of February of 1895. Mara saw him when he was still at the bottom of the back 40 path, a figure moving slowly across the lower pasture in the thin winter light, not with the slowness of a man whose body was failing him, because Caleb at 66 was still capable on rough ground, and she had seen him move faster than this when the occasion required it. This was a different slowness. The deliberate, considered pace of a man who is using the distance between where he is and where he is going to prepare himself for something he is not entirely sure how to do. She had not seen him on the back 40 path in 3 years. Not since the morning he had handed her the deed and the tools and then gone back to the main house in the valley and left her to it. She had seen him at the market, occasionally at the general store, at the margin of the church congregation, on the Sunday she attended. They had been civil in the way of people who share a loss and a history and have not yet determined what to do with either of them. She came down from the roof and stood at the cabin doorway and waited. He came up the last slope and stopped a few feet from her and looked at the cabin with the expression she had come to recognize over 3 years, the careful, slightly averted attention of a man trying to read something he wasn't sure he deserved to read. He was older than she remembered from the deed transaction. Not dramatically so, but in the specific way that winter settles into a person who has been spending cold months indoors with thoughts he cannot change. His face held the weight of that. She did not say anything. She let him look. "Can I see the roof?" She gestured toward the notched log ladder on the east wall. He climbed it more slowly than she climbed it, testing each rung before committing his weight, one hand always on the side rail, his breath making small clouds in the February air. When he came over the top edge and straightened up and stood on the deck, he stopped and was still for a long time. The February sun was low on the south-facing slope, the angle that Mara had understood from her first afternoon in the cabin, the angle that came in flat and direct through the south-facing doorway and traveled the full depth of the interior. At this hour, it hit the roof surface directly for the 40-minute window that made the glass squares glow with the quiet luminosity of something that has been doing its work steadily and without interruption for a longer time and is simply doing it now. 23 squares, butter lettuce dense and green under each pane, the heads pressing up against the glass from below. The winter rye holding the soil between them in a continuous living surface pale gold, where it had been cut and left as mulch with new green pushing through at the base, the plant's annual return already underway in the last weeks of February, the root system coming back, because that was what the root system did when the conditions held. The whole surface warmed to the touch, even in February, even with the air temperature below 30 degrees. Caleb walked the roof slowly. He stopped at each glass square and looked down through the pane at what was growing beneath it. He knelt at one of the southern squares, the ones that got the longest light exposure, where the lettuce had been growing for 6 weeks and had reached the stage of full density, and put his bare hand flat against the glass. He held it there. She watched him feel what was there to feel warmth from below, conducted up through 6 inches of soil and 3 inches of chestnut plank in the airspace of the cabin interior. Warmth that the fire in the fireplace had put out, and the system had moved upward and stored warmth in February in the Blue Ridge Mountains that had no business being where it was by any reasoning that did not account for what she had built. He stood and walked to the north edge. He looked up at the ridge, the spur that ran directly behind the cabin, 60 feet higher than the north wall, close enough to deflect the prevailing winter wind off the mountain before it reached the structure below. He had known that ridge his entire life. He had walked its length. He had hunted its upper slopes. He had known the geography of it, the way you know the features of a place you grew up in, by presence, by familiarity, by the fact of having been around it long enough that it stopped being something you looked at. He was looking at it now. He turned and looked south across the full length of the roof, past the glass squares and the rye and the south edge of the deck, and down the slope toward the valley. On the far ridge, the Whitfield house was a white rectangle among bare trees just beginning to think about coming back into leaf. Small. Small from here. Part of the landscape. He was on the roof for a long time. When he came down, Mara had coffee on the fire. She poured it into a tin cup and set it on the chestnut table, and he sat down and wrapped his hands around the cup the way a man holds something warm when he is cold in a way that has nothing to do with the temperature. He looked at the table. He looked at the fireplace. He looked at the ceiling. He looked finally at her. When he spoke, the words came slowly with the care of a man who has rehearsed something, and then in the moment of saying it, understood that what he rehearsed was insufficient for what the moment actually required. "I'm sorry about the roof." He looked at the cup. "I'm sorry about all of it." He was not talking about the cedar shake that had rotted in 1884. She knew that. He knew she knew it. He was talking about the room at the back of the main house and the 6 weeks between September and November of 1892, and the Tuesday morning with the deed and the particular quality of management that had characterized those weeks, the careful, polite, opaque management of a situation by people who could not bring themselves to look at it directly. He was talking about the 3 years since then in which he had not come to the back 40 and had not asked how she was managing. He was a man who had done something that required making right and who had come to try to make it right in the only way available to him now, which was to say the words and mean them and offer nothing in addition, because there was nothing in addition that was his to offer. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said what was true. "The roof is the best part, Caleb." She held his gaze. She had something else to say, and she wanted him to hear it without the cushion of sentiment around it, which would have reduced it. Eli would have liked it. She meant the construction, the hickory pins, the chestnut planking, the birch bark, the system of the thing. Because Eli had understood the relationship between good materials and careful work, and what that relationship produced when a person took it seriously, and the roof was exactly the kind of thing that had represented everything he believed was worth believing about how to build something that lasted. But she meant other things too, and Caleb heard them because his hands tightened slightly on the cup and his jaw moved once, and then he looked down at the table and did not say anything for a while. It was not forgiveness as a gift. It was the truth as a statement. Both of them understood the difference, and the difference was what made it possible to sit at the same table with the coffee between them and be two people who had both lost someone and had found without planning to that they were capable of occupying the same room without the loss requiring management. He finished his coffee before he left. He did not say whether he would come back. She did not ask. The conversation had done what it needed to do, and the rest would follow from that in whatever way it followed. Some things did not need to be scheduled in advance. Some things simply happened when the conditions held. Delia Whitfield came in the spring. 6 weeks after Caleb on a Tuesday, which Mara noted without assigning significance to it, was possible Delia had chosen the day deliberately mirroring the day that Caleb had come to her 3 years before with the deed, or it was possible that Tuesday was simply the day when the decision that Delia had been building toward was finally complete, because it was a decision. That much was clear from the way she arrived, not with the tentative quality of someone uncertain of their reception, but with the specific quality of a person who has been arguing with herself for a considerable time and has finally settled the argument and is now executing the conclusion. The argument was over. What remained was the conversation. Delia was 44 years old and had been managing the Whitfield household and its arrangements since before Mara had come into the family. She was capable, organized, and had an intelligence that had spent most of its life operating in service of maintaining the structure of things as they were. She stood at the cabin doorway and looked at Mara in the clear April light, and the history between them was present, without either of them having to address it the way weather is present, before it arrives felt and known before it can be named. She spoke first. I read the article in the Asheville paper. Not an apology, not an opening. An establishment of terms, a starting point that was neutral enough to build from offering a shared fact rather than a personal admission. I didn't know you knew things like that. Mara let a moment pass. She was deciding on accuracy rather than kindness, because accuracy was what the moment required, and kindness at the expense of accuracy was not kindness at all. You didn't ask. 3 words. Delia absorbed them without visible reaction, which was her particular skill. The ability to receive information that reflected poorly on her decisions without showing the reception. She looked at Mara for a moment longer. Then she asked if she could see the roof. She climbed the ladder with more ease than Caleb had because Delia had been doing physical work her entire adult life, and a ladder presented no particular challenge. She stood on the deck in the April light and looked at what was there in its spring condition. The rye had been cut for the season and lay as mulch between the growing squares. The early summer crops were just in bean seedlings, showing their first true leaves on the south edge herb starch that Mara had grown in the cabin over winter, and transplanted out when the nights held above freezing the soil in each square, dark and warm, and alive with the biological processes that 3 years of careful tending had established. Delia walked the deck without hurrying. She looked at the glass squares and the seed furrows and the organization of the surface, the way the growing areas in the rye mulch and the walkable paths between them had been laid out not according to any plan Mara could have described in advance, but according to the accumulated understanding of 3 years of watching what the system wanted to do and helping it do it. She walked to the south edge. From there, the view opened down the slope to the valley below and across the valley to the far ridge where the Whitfield house stood, among trees now fully leafed out in the tender green of early April, the color that lasts only 2 weeks before deepening into the settled green of summer. The house looked small from here, the way everything looks small from the right elevation. Mara did not ask what Delia thought while she stood there. She understood that what Delia was thinking was not available to her and was not her business. What Delia had been instrumental in bringing about the room at the back of the house, the careful management, the deed and the direction it pointed and what had come from it were facts that Delia was reckoning with in her own way, and the reckoning was private. That was her right. When Delia came down, her face had a quality that had not been there when she arrived. Something worked through, not resolved. Some things were not resolvable but acknowledged. The specific expression of a person who has seen something that has shifted the relationship between what they knew and what they understood, and who is living in the space between those two things. She did not apologize. Mara had not expected an apology and had decided some time ago that an apology, if it came, would be a lesser thing than what Delia was capable of offering, which was directness. Gideon wants to know if you'd sell seedlings. She said it without preamble, looking at Mara directly in a way she had not looked at her in 3 years. He's thinking about extending the kitchen garden season. A cold frame, maybe 2. Mara considered this. The request was legitimate. She had seedlings she could sell, starts that she had grown beyond what she needed for her own plantings, the natural excess of a practice that required starting more than you knew you would use because some percentage always failed, and she had learned to account for the failure rate by beginning with more than the final number required. The seedlings were sitting in their soil blocks in the cabin, waiting to be either planted or discarded. But Gideon Whitfield wanted something from her. The family that had directed her out of the main house through a sequence of carefully managed indirection now wanted something she had that they did not. The terms of that transaction were hers to set, and the terms she set would define what the transaction was, whether it was commerce or concession, whether it was solvable or loaded. Fair market price. She said it evenly, without sharpness. Sharpness would have suggested that the terms were personal, and they were not personal. They were commercial. Same price I charge anyone else who asks. Delia looked at her for a moment. Then she nodded once. She said she would tell Gideon. She walked down the back 40 path toward the valley, and Mara stood at the cabin doorway and watched her go and felt the specific satisfaction of a situation that has been brought to its correct conclusion. Not a warm conclusion, not a reunion, but the right one in which the terms were accurate and the exchange was honest, and what had passed between them had been named without being dramatized. Commerce was sufficient. Commerce was in fact a more honest form of relationship than the managed pleasantness that had preceded it. Managed pleasantness required everyone to pretend. Commerce required everyone to be clear. She would take clear over pretend every time. The autumn of the first year. Not the first calendar year, but the first full cycle, the first time October came around again after the seeding of November 1892, the first time the wheel had turned all the way back to the beginning. Mara climbed the ladder on an early October morning in 1893. The air had the particular quality of the first cold mornings in the southern mountains, not the deep cold of January, not the aggressive cold of February, but the preliminary cold that arrives in October, like an announcement clear and sharp and carrying in it the information that what comes next will be serious. She came over the top of the ladder and stood on the deck. The rye had come back. She had not seeded it. She had not prepared the soil for its return or done anything to encourage it. She had cleared the summer crops in September, had turned the spent plants under, had amended the soil in the growing squares, and cut back the spent growth. She had done, in other words, the work of a gardener, finishing one season and preparing for the next. She had not seeded rye because the rye was already there, the root system from the previous year's planting, intact beneath the soil, waiting for the temperature to drop far enough that germination was triggered, and then germinating, because that was what winter rye did when it had been established long enough that the roots had taken hold in the soil they were in. Thin blades, the same pale translucent green as the first time pushing up through the dark soil in the uneven distribution of a plant whose seed has been set by a previous generation rather than by a hand broadcasting this season. The rye had seeded itself. She stood on the deck for a long time. She thought about Bertie. She thought about the kitchen table and the coffee cup and the particular voice of a woman who had spent 60 years accumulating knowledge that she could not have written down because the knowledge was not the kind that survived transcription. It lived in demonstration, in the pointing toward, and the saying, do you see it in the specific moment when the person being shown was ready to see? She thought about how long it takes for that kind of knowledge to travel, how many people it passes through, how many generations of women at kitchen tables saying the same thing in slightly different words until the words become irrelevant and only the knowledge remains moving forward without the need of the particular mouths that carried it. Bertie had known because her grandmother had known. Her grandmother had known because the women in the hollow had known. The women in the hollow had known because the women before them had known, and those women had known because necessity had taught them, and they had been honest enough to learn what necessity was teaching. The chain was very long, and here at the end of it, or not the end, but the current point, the place where it reached the present, was a 24-year-old woman on a rooftop in Madison County, North Carolina, with her grandmother's rye coming back on its own, in the soil she had built with her own hands on a roof she had constructed out of materials that had been lying around waiting to be understood. The circle was running, not because she was running it, because she had built it correctly from accurate principles, and correct systems built on accurate principles did not require constant intervention. They required tending. They required attention. They required someone to respond when they spoke and to give them what they needed in the right season. But they did not require the person tending them to be the engine of them. The engine was the system itself. Something gave way in her chest. She had been moving for a year without stopping, had been moving, if she was honest, since the knock on the door in Yancey County in September of 1892, moving through grief and through the weeks in the back room and through the walk to the cabin and the arithmetic in the dark and the first pole cut and the first plank laid, moving with the forward momentum of a person who understands that stopping is not currently available as an option. She had built the momentum into a system, and the system had taken it over, and the system was running, and she had stopped. And what came up when she stopped was not grief exactly, though it had grief in it. Not pride, though it had that too. It was something more like recognition. The specific feeling of understanding that you have arrived somewhere You were always moving toward without knowing that was where you were going. The rye returning without her permission. The circle turning without her hand on it. She did not have a name for what it felt like to build a circle that ran. She cried for the first time since Eli died. Not long, not with the drama of long-delayed release. She sat on the deck in the October cold with the green rye at her knees, and she cried the way a person cries when they have been given something they understand cannot be replaced and cannot be reproduced and exists in the world in this one form only, not the grief of losing it, but the full weight of having it, the knowledge of everything it had cost to come to this particular morning and look at this particular green and feel it move through her like current through a good conductor. Below, she could hear Edmund. She had become aware of his presence on the property in the way you become aware of a thing that has been around long enough to register as reliable, not loud, not demanding attention, simply there. He had come down the ridge path with his notebook and was sitting below the east wall at the base of the ladder, writing. She could hear the scratch of the pencil from 15 feet above him. He did not call up to her. He did not pretend not to notice. He simply opened his notebook and wrote because he was a man who responded to things that mattered to him by recording them, and what was happening on the roof above him mattered to him in a way he would not have known how to say directly, but could put down precisely on paper. She was glad sitting on the deck in the October cold, with the rye at her knees and the tears still on her face, that whatever he was writing would last longer than either of them. The years accumulated with the specific quality of years that are not waiting for something to happen, but are themselves the thing that is happening. The income from the roof grew in the way that consistent things grow, not dramatically, not in peaks, but in the steady compounding of a system that improves marginally each season as the operator understands it better and makes the small adjustments that produce slightly better outcomes than the previous year. $78 in the third year, 91 in the fifth, 104 in the seventh. After she adjusted the soil composition a second time, increasing the proportion of leaf mold and reducing the clay content that she had observed was compacting at the base of the 6-inch layer and retaining moisture too long into the spring. An 11% improvement in yield, which she knew because she measured it. She measured it because Edmund had shown her by example, and over years of watching him work, that a thing observed without record existed only in the memory of the observer and died with them. She measured what mattered and let the rest exist as context. 23 glass squares at peak. She had determined this was the number that balanced production against her ability to harvest and carry and sell and maintain. The roof could have carried more. She could not have managed more efficiently. A system sized beyond the capacity of the person running it was not a larger system. It was a failing one, Schwauung. She kept it at 23. The bear came in July of the second year on a Thursday night and investigated the tomato plants with the methodical thoroughness of an animal that has found something interesting and wants to determine its full extent before deciding what to do with it. Mara climbed the ladder with an empty tin bucket and stood on the top rung and occupied as much vertical space as she could, and the bear, after a period of mutual assessment, decided the situation was not worth investigating further and went over the north edge and up the ridge with a casualness that suggested the descent presented no challenge. She assessed the damage by lamplight, 6 tomatoes lost, 3 plants bent, but mendable, and spent the following week building a low chestnut rail fence around the perimeter of the deck that was barely enough to stop a determined bear, but enough to require any bear to make a committed choice about entering rather than wandering in from casual curiosity. The beans climbed the fence rails and covered the east side in a dense curtain by August. More yield per square foot than anything she had grown flat, because the vertical surface gave the plants access to light that horizontal planting denied them. The fence that started as a response to a bear became one of the most productive surfaces on the roof. She noted this the way she noted everything the system did when it was allowed to follow its own logic as information about how the materials and the plants in the structure wanted to behave, which was information she could use. Edmund wrote about all of it. He sent pieces to journals in Knoxville and Baltimore, neither of which responded. He sent a longer account to a natural history publication in Raleigh that expressed interest and then went quiet. He was not discouraged. He had spent 6 decades sending his observations into a world that was largely indifferent to them, and had developed the equanimity of a man who understood that the gap between what he noticed and what other people were ready to notice was a function of timing rather than merit. The gap closed eventually or it didn't. Either way, the observation had been made and recorded, and that was the point. The notebooks accumulated. By the summer of 1899, he had filled his 19th. He came for the last time in September of that year. He had been slower on the ridge path since spring, his hip giving him trouble on the downhill sections, and he had begun sending word ahead of his visits so that Mara could meet him at the bottom of the slope and walk up with him. She did this without making it a subject of conversation, and he accepted the arrangement without discussing what it implied, because what it implied was understood by both of them and did not require the additional weight of being said. He still climbed the roof. When he came over the edge and stood on the deck that September morning, the fall planting was just in the rye seeded for the season. The cool weather crops in their glass squares, the spinach and lettuce, and spring onion that would carry through to April. The system was in its 7th year. It had not failed once in any season, in any weather, in any way that had not been addressed and incorporated and made part of the system's ongoing function. He walked the full extent of the deck, slowly stopping at each growing square, looking at the soil in the spaces between, reading what was there. Then he sat down in the center of the roof between 2 rows of glass squares and opened his 19th notebook. He drew for a long time. He wrote for longer. Mara worked beside him without speaking, checking the soil temperature in the northern squares, pressing her hand into the surface, and reading the warmth the way she read everything about the system, now not as data to be recorded, but as conversation, the roof telling her what it needed and she understanding what she had to give. When he was done, he closed the notebook and looked at her. "You should know that I've left the notebooks to the Madison County Library." He said it with the flatness he gave to most things that carried significant weight, the fact delivered clearly allowed to stand on its own. All 19 of them. There's more than 40 pages on this roof. She did not say anything immediately. She thought about 19 notebooks. She thought about 40 years of observation in those notebooks, the names of plants and dates of flowering, and the behavior of weather systems, and the notes on soil composition, and the drawings of things that had been interesting enough to draw, which was most things. 40 pages of that set aside specifically for what she had built on this back 40. He was looking at the glass squares, at the rye between them, at the soil that had been on this roof for 7 years and had grown more things than either of them had originally believed it could. "You've done more than grow food," he said. She waited. "You've demonstrated something. That's different." He looked at her. Demonstration outlasts the thing demonstrated. She understood what he meant. The lettuce was seasonal. The rye came and went. But the fact of them, the documented, observed, recorded fact, that a woman in Madison County in 1892 had built a living roof and heated her soil with her own fire and grown food in January and sold it in February, that fact lived in 19 notebooks going to a library and in an article in the Asheville Citizen, and in the memories of everyone who had bought greens from her table in winter, and in the particular way that knowledge moved through communities without always being attributed and without always being precise but present passed from person to person in the way that useful things got passed. She walked with him down the ridge path that afternoon and said goodbye at the bottom of the back 40 slope, and he went up his own ridge toward his own cabin, and she watched him go until the trees closed around him. He died 6 weeks later in the last week of October. The cold found the places where he had thinned. The library received the 19 notebooks in November. Mara went to see them the following spring. She was in Marshall for the market on a Saturday in April when she stopped at the library on her way home, the empty basket on her arm, the coins from the day's sales in her coat pocket. The librarian, a woman of about 50 who had read enough of the notebooks to understand who Mara was, when she came through the door, showed her the volumes without being asked, carrying them from the back room, and setting them on the reading table with the care reserved for things that have been given into your keeping, rather than simply cataloged. 19 notebooks. Identical in format, the same size, the same cover, the same careful hand throughout each page dated at the top, and organized with the precision of a man for whom the act of recording was itself a form of respect for the subject. She opened the 19th notebook to the entry dated November 23, 1892, 2 days after she had first seen the green. The handwriting was small and precise, each letter formed with the attention of a man who had written tens of thousands of them and had never stopped treating each one as worth the effort it required. She read it once, then she read it again, visited the Whitfield cabin on the back 40. A young woman is building a sod roof of the Appalachian type. She knows exactly what she is doing. I do not think she knows yet what it will become. I should come back. She turned to the entry for February 3rd, 1893, the day he had first climbed the roof and sat on the deck and opened his notebook and begun to draw. Lettuce on the roof. The cabin heats the soil grows the food insulates the cabin. She has built a circle. It is the most elegant thing I have seen in 61 years of looking at how things grow. I gave her my windows. It was the correct decision. She stood at the library table with her hands flat on the cover of the open notebook, looking at his handwriting. She stood there for a long time. She thought about the brass spyglass with the cracked lens and the amber cast it gave to everything seen through it. The distance made warmer, the far ridge made more golden than it actually was, the world at 400 yards appearing slightly more worth looking at than the world close up. She thought about a man who had spent 61 years filling notebooks with things he had watched and who had come down off his ridge in November of 1892 because there was something on the opposing slope that he could not classify, and the inability to classify it had kept him up at night. She thought about what the partnership had been, not friendship exactly, though it had become that, in the way of people who are honest with each other consistently enough that the honesty becomes its own kind of intimacy. Not mentorship, because he had not been teaching her and she had not been learning from him, not in any direction that ran one way. It had been something more precise than either of those things. He had brought language. She had brought application. Between the two of them, they had produced 40 pages in a library notebook and an article in the Asheville Citizen and 7 years of documented growing seasons. Neither of them could have produced that alone. He could not have built the roof. She could not have written the notebook in the language of botanical science and thermal principles that would allow someone in Baltimore or Knoxville to understand what had been accomplished and why it worked. The knowledge she carried was embodied, inherited, demonstrated. It lived in her hands and in her grandmother's voice and in the specific action of pressing your palm against a wall to know whether it would hold. It did not translate easily into the vocabulary that traveled. Edmund Voss had made it translate. He had known that from the morning he came down off the ridge. He had known it, she understood now, before she had. That was what the November 23rd entry said. I do not think she knows yet what it will become. He had seen it from 400 yards through an amber lens 2 days after the green appeared, and he had known. She closed the notebook carefully. She thanked the librarian. She picked up her basket and walked out into the April afternoon and down the main street of Marshall and onto the road home, and the spring was fully underway in the valley. The trees leafed out the lower slopes green, the mountains doing what they did in April after the long winter, which was to become themselves again as if they had never stopped. She stayed in the cabin for 17 years in total. The rye came back every October without fail, following the rhythm established in the first November, and never interrupted, not even in the years when the winters were hardest and the springs were slowest, and the growing season on the slope below was reduced to a fraction of what it was in a good year. The root system had been in the soil long enough that it was the soil part of the organic structure of it, inseparable from the clay and leaf mold and aged manure that she had mixed and carried bucket by bucket up the ladder in November of 1892. The birch bark she replaced in 1901 when she noticed the waterproofing beginning to soften at the south edge. She went back to the same stand on the ridge. The trees had healed over the harvest marks from 9 years before, the bark grown back, smooth and tight, and peeled new sheets with the same caretaking, only the outer layer, leaving the cambium intact. The replacement took 3 days. When it was done, the deck was as sound as it had been in the beginning. The chestnut planking she never replaced. It did not need it. The income reached $104 in the 7th year and stayed near that figure for the remaining decade of her tenancy, varying with the seasons and the weather and the fluctuations of what the market in Marshall could absorb, but trending on a line that was consistent in the way she had learned to value consistency, not as a ceiling, but as a floor. Agnes Whitfield died in the winter of 1908. She had been failing since the previous spring in the slow way of mountain women, who have worked hard their entire lives and whose bodies begin at a certain point to take an accounting of the cost. Caleb was alone in the main house in the valley after January, with the particular quality of a loan that descends on a man who has spent 40 years in a house full of other people and finds himself in it suddenly by himself. Mara moved back to the main house in the spring of 1909. Not out of obligation, she had fulfilled every obligation that could be asked of her, and more, an obligation was not the currency she operated in. She moved because of the particular affection that develops between two people who have both been shaped by the same loss and have found over the years, and at considerable cost to both of them, that they understand each other's silences without requiring them to be filled. Caleb was 69 years old and alone in a house that had 8 rooms, and Mara was 40 years old and had built everything she had come to the back 40 to build. The circle was running, it would keep running. She left the cabin intact. She left the roof undisturbed. She told the librarian, the same woman who had shown her Edmund's notebooks 9 years before that, the cabin was standing and the roof was sound, and anyone who wanted to see it could walk the back 40 path without difficulty. She said this not as an invitation, but as a fact that deserved to be in the record somewhere, even if only in the memory of a librarian who understood what she was being told. On the morning she left, she climbed the ladder one last time. The roof in April was the same as it had been every April for 17 years. The rye coming into its spring growth, the growing squares, prepared for planting, the soil warm under her hands at every point of the deck, the warmth rising from the fire she had banked low in the fireplace below, and would not build again. She pressed her palm flat against the soil in the northeast corner, the corner that had failed in the January storm 16 years before, and had become the warmest part of the roof in doing so, and held it there for a moment. Still warm, still alive, still running. She climbed back down. She did not look back at the cabin as she walked down the back 40 path toward the valley. She did not need to. She carried it with her, not as a memory, but as a fact, the way you carry things that have become part of the structure of how you understand the world to work, so thoroughly incorporated that they no longer need to be looked at in order to be present. The cabin is still there. The walls are still true. 43 years of mountain winters could not move them in Caleb's father's time, and the years since have added to what they held without adding to what they owe. The chimney still stands straight above the north wall, the same stones from the same creek bed, the same mortar, the same clean line rising into whatever sky the season provides. The glass squares are long gone. They came down one by one as the frames rotted or the panes cracked, each one failing in its own season, until the last of them disappeared sometime in the years when the people who knew what they were for were no longer there to maintain them. The rye went to wild grass, and the wild grass to woody plants, and the woody plants to whatever comes next in the slow succession of things returning to the mountain. But the deck holds its plane. Go up there in October in the low-angled light when the shadows are long and the contours of the land are most readable. Look down from the ridge at the right moment. You can still see the outline, a rectangle slightly elevated above the surrounding slope, the shape of a decision pressed into the landscape, and held there by 43-year-old poplar walls built by a man who understood that the mountain did not accommodate carelessness, and by a 7-inch layer of Appalachian soil that remembers what it was asked to hold. And sometimes in the right season, in the October light, you can see green up there. Thin blades, pale and new, growing from soil that has not been tended in over a century in a place where nobody planted anything. Edmund Voss wrote in the entry for February 3rd, 1893, "She has built a circle. It is the most elegant thing I have seen in 61 years of looking at how things grow." He was right. It ran for 17 years without stopping, and stopped only because the person who tended it had other work to do, not because the system itself had failed, not because the principles on which it was built had been found wanting, not because the materials had given out. Systems built on accurate principles both do not fail in the ways that improvised things fail. They run until someone decides to stop running them. She had not made something from nothing. She had made something from what was already there, the poplar walls and the chestnut tree and the birch stand on the ridge and the creek bottom clay and the leaf mold and Eli's tools and Bertie's voice and the specific angle of a south-facing doorway in the Blue Ridge Mountains in the low winter sun. She had looked at what was there and understood what it was for and built accordingly. That was all. That was everything. Nobody in Madison County has forgotten that someone once did this, not because they were told to remember. Because the thing itself was memorable, not dramatic, not loud, not requiring anything of the people who encountered it, except that they look at it and understand that what they were seeing was real. The way the ride coming back in October without being asked is real. The way a chimney that still draws after 43 years is real. The way a 23-year-old woman with $11 and a clear understanding of what a roof was actually for looked up at a pewter sky through the open top of a roofless cabin and heard her grandmother's voice and knew exactly what to do. She had built a circle. It ran and ran and did not stop.